Hello students, in today's class we are going to discuss anti-inflammatory drugs, or the drugs we known as NSAIDs, that is non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, or we can say non-opioid analgesic or non-narcotic analgesics or aspirin like compounds. So in today's class we are going to mainly discuss the non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. So, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs are basically used to treat inflammation, mild to moderate pain, and fever. Because all the drugs grouped in this category have analgesic property, antipyretic property, and anti-inflammatory property in different measures. But they do have all these three types of property. A drug may have more of analgesic property but less of antipyretic property and less of anti-inflammatory property, or second drug may have more anti-inflammatory property but lesser antipyretic property. But all the drugs in this class do have all these three properties in different proportions. These non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs are also called non-opioid analgesic or non-narcotic analgesics, because they do have analgesic property but they do not show their action by interacting with opioid receptors, and they do not depress the brain or CNS. These agents do not produce physical dependence and have no abuse liability. They act primarily on peripheral pain mechanism, but they also act in CNS to raise pain threshold, but mainly they act on peripheral pain mechanism. So the drugs in this class are widely utilized for the treatment of minor aches, pains, fever, and symptomatic treatment of rheumatic fever, arthritis, and osteoarthritis. The compounds in this category, or we can say the NSAIDs, act by inhibition of cyclooxygenase enzyme system that catalyze the synthesis of prostaglandins from arachidonic acid. So now we will discuss the chemical classification of non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug. And let me tell you one thing: this category is called non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug because the compound of this class do not have a steroidal nucleus like the uh, narcotic analgesics, and they do not interact with opioid receptors. They do not cause CNS depression or any kind of physical dependence or abuse liability. They don't have. So if we discuss the chemical classification of non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug, the first category in this class is the salicylic acid derivatives, in which we have the sodium salicylate and aspirin, and these both are the first generation of non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, and they are still used in many indications. The second category we have in this class is N-anthranilic acid derivatives, in which we have the mefenamic acid, flufenamic acid, and meclofenamate. The third category in the class is propionic acid derivatives, or which we also known as profenes, in which we have ibuprofen and ketoprofen. Next category is aryl acetic acid derivative, and in this class we have different categories. The first we have the indole acetic acid derivatives, in which we have the indomethacin. Next we have indene acetic acid derivative, in which we have the sulindac. The next category in this class we have the naphthalene acetic acid derivative, in which we have naproxen. Then comes the pyrrole acetic acid derivative, in which we have the talmethin sodium and zompyrex sodium. Next category is dichlorophenyl acetic acid derivatives, in which we have diclofenac, which is widely used analgesic agent. Now the next category in NSAID class is oxychems, or the other name is enol acid derivatives, in which we have pyroxychem, and then we have para-aminophenol derivatives, in which we have the phenacetin and acetaminophen, which is commonly known as paracetamol. Then we have pyrazole derivatives, in which we have antipyrine and aminopyrine. The next category is pyrazolidine 3,5-dione derivatives, in which we have phenylbutazone, oxyphenbutazone. In next category we have coxiv, which is selective COX-2 inhibitors, in which we have celecoxib and rofecoxib, but none of this compound is being sold in the Indian market. The next category we have is miscellaneous category, in which we have nimesulide, nebumetone and ketorolac. In this, the nimesulide is a preferential COX-2 inhibitor, and the coxibs are selective COX-2 inhibitor, while rest of the compounds in NSAIDs are non-selective COX inhibitor. It means the non-selective COX-2 inhibitors are the agents which inhibit COX-1 enzyme as well as COX-2 enzyme. We will discuss it in detail in the mechanism of action. So if we discuss the mechanism of action of non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug, the non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug show their therapeutic action by inhibition of cyclooxygenase enzyme system. What the cyclooxygenase enzyme does, it simply catalyzes the synthesis of prostaglandins from arachidonic acid. What happens in the inflammation mainly is the membrane phospholipids is converted into the arachidonic acid by phospholipase enzyme A, and then cyclooxygenase enzyme act on arachidonic acid and convert them into the prostaglandins, that is mainly prostaglandin G2 and prostaglandin S2. These prostaglandins then converted into different type of prostaglandins, and you can say thromboxanes and prostacyclins. So these all are the inflammatory mediators. Some of these prostaglandins produce inflammatory response, but some of the prostaglandins also produce some protective function in the body. Mainly the cyclooxygenase enzyme, the COX enzyme, is consist of two types of enzyme, that is COX-1 and COX-2, COX first and COX second. The COX second or COX-2 enzyme is mainly responsible for the production of prostaglandins, that is mainly responsible for inflammatory response. But the COX-1 enzyme also produce some prostaglandins which perform some protective function into the body, like the maintenance of gastric mucosa, which protect our stomach and intestine from the gastric acid. So if we simply inhibit both of these enzymes, the COX-1 and COX-2, if a drug non-selectively inhibit COX-1 and COX-2, it means it also inhibiting the inflammatory prostaglandins and cytoprotective prostaglandins, because cytoprotective prostaglandins are produced by COX-1 and the inflammatory prostaglandins are mainly produced by COX-2. If we non-selectively inhibit the COX-1 and COX-2, then COX-2 is also inhibited and COX-1 is also inhibited. So inflammatory response prostaglandin synthesis is blocked, as well as cytoprotective prostaglandin synthesis is blocked. So we will get rid of inflammation and fever, but at the same time we will suffer with some side effects like gastric ulcer, which is very common with non-selective COX inhibitors. And most of the compound we use in NSAIDs are non-selective COX inhibitor, like aspirin, or you can say diclofenac, paracetamol. These all are commonly used non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug, but they all are non-selective COX inhibitor. If we talk about the Nemuslide is a preferential COX-2 inhibitor. It means it inhibit the COX-2 enzyme to a more extent than COX-1 enzyme. But if we talk about the coxibs, the celecoxib and rofecoxib, the coxibs selectively inhibit only COX-2 enzyme. They do not inhibit the COX-1 enzyme. So they do not produce certain kind of side effects like gastric irritation and all, but they do have their own problems like nephrotoxicity and all, and because of that they were withdrawn from the market. So this is all for today's class. I think that this is going to help you in the topic of NSAIDs. Thank you.